There is a certain kind of quiet that you can only hear after you stop moving. It's the silence after the last plate is dried, the last guest has gone home, and the house settles into its bones. For 40 years, my quiet was filled with the hum of the oven, the rhythm of a whisk, and the sweet, sharp scent of lemon. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, I heard a different kind of quiet. It was the sound of a lie so small it could fit on a price tag. And that's when I stopped baking his cake. Good evening, my dears. Come in, sit down. Make yourselves comfortable. Tonight, I want to talk to you about visibility. About what it means to be the steady heartbeat of a home that no one thinks to listen for. This isn't a story of a loud fight or a dramatic scandal. It's a story about a lemon pound cake, a grocery store, and how a lifetime of love can evaporate in the space of a single, senseless deception. It's about how, after 40 years, I finally learned that the most powerful thing a woman can sometimes do is not make a scene, but simply disappear from the role she was never meant to play. The recipe was never just a list of ingredients, a set of instructions on a faded card. It was the physical text of my devotion, my daily scripture. I measured my worth in cups of flour and teaspoons of vanilla. I believed if I followed it precisely, if I achieved that perfect golden crust and that dense moist crumb, then I would have performed my love correctly, and that performance would be my security, my place, my undeniable evidence of being a good wife. The cake was my offering, my atonement for not being louder, for not being more like his mother, for not having the kind of career that impressed his friends. It was my quiet answer to every unspoken critique, my edible apology for simply being myself, a woman who preferred silence to gossip, who found joy in the garden more than at a crowded party. That cake was my translator. It spoke a language his family understood, a language of sweetness and tradition and obligation. It said, see, I may be different, but I know my duties. I respect your ways. I am one of you because I have mastered this one thing you hold dear. The act of baking, it was my meditation, my prayer. The early morning light through the kitchen window, the sound of the egg cracking against the bowl, the smell of lemon zest releasing its oil into the sugar. These were the sacred elements of my ritual. This was the time when the house was truly mine, when I could move through the space without considering his presence, his preferences, his schedule. It was in those quiet hours before dawn that I felt a semblance of ownership over my own life. I was creating something. I was in control of the process, the alchemy of turning separate simple things into a cohesive whole. It was the one thing I did that felt like art, like a gentle magic, and I foolishly believed that magic transferred into the cake, that he could taste the care, the quiet hours, the love I needed into every step. I believed he could taste my history, the memory of my own grandmother's kitchen, the warmth I was trying to recreate from a childhood that was softer than the one I found myself in. It was my anchor at every family event, a sea of faces that never quite looked like mine, a chorus of conversations that often flowed around me. I could slip into the kitchen to check on it, to baste it with the lemon syrup, and in that moment I had a purpose. I was needed. The cake was my contribution, my ticket of admission. When I placed it on the table on my grandmother's china platter, there would be a murmur of approval, a momentary silence as it was sliced, and that was my applause. That was the recognition I received. It was how I earned my seat at the table, not through my words or my ideas, but through this tangible, edible proof of my labor. It was my love made visible, my effort condensed into something they could consume and compliment. For 40 years I built the architecture of our marriage around that ritual. The anticipation of events was marked by the buying of extra butter, the selecting of the finest lemons, his mother's birthday, the cake, his nephew's graduation, the cake, a difficult week at work, the cake. It became my response to everything, joy, grief, stress. It was how I soothed, how I celebrated, how I apologized. It was how I said, I am here and I am paying attention even when you think I am not. I saw the slight slump in his shoulders after he visited his mother, and I would bake. I heard the tension in his voice about work, and I would bake. The cake was my empathy, my silent understanding. I thought I was weaving us together stitch by stitch. With each batch I believed I was building something permanent, a monument to constancy. But a covenant requires two parties to recognize its terms. I was upholding my end with a religious fervor, but he was simply eating cake. To him it was a dessert, a nice tradition, a thing that was simply always there, like the sunrise or the color of the walls. It had lost all meaning because it had never cost him anything. He never saw the thought behind it, the choice to use real butter when margarine would have been cheaper, the careful zesting to avoid the bitter pith, the precise moment to take it from the oven so it wouldn't dry. He never once asked about the process, he only ever acknowledged the result, and even that acknowledgement was casual, perfunctory, a simple good cake before moving on to the next thing. I mistook his consumption for communion. I thought because he ate it he understood the language I was speaking, but he was illiterate in the dialect of my devotion. He heard only the word cake, not the lifetime of sentences that came before it. The recipe was my covenant, but I was the only one who had taken the vow, the only one who showed up every time to recite the words with my hands covered in flour. The covenant was with myself, a promise to be useful, to be good, to be the steady, unwavering thing in the center of the home, and for 40 years I kept that promise with a discipline that would shame a monk. I believed my faithfulness to that recipe was the same as faithfulness to the marriage, that my precision in baking mirrored my precision in love. I built a fortress of kindness around him with sugar and butter and eggs. I thought it would protect us. I thought it would create a warmth, a sweetness that would permeate the very walls of our life. But a fortress built by one person is just a prison for the builder. I was inside baking tirelessly while he lived freely outside the walls, occasionally wandering in for a slice. He never felt the weight of the stones I carried, never felt the chill of the kitchen at dawn. He just enjoyed the treat. The recipe was my covenant, a solemn promise I made to an ideal of marriage, to a ghost of a man I thought he could be, a man who would one day see not just the cake but the baker. The tragedy is not that he broke the covenant, it is that he never knew one existed. He thought we had a simple understanding: I bake, you eat. He never heard the vows I was repeating to myself every single time I preheated the oven. The affair would have been almost understandable. A moment of passion, a weakness of the flesh, a terrible error born of some human hunger I perhaps failed to satisfy. That would have been a wound with a name, a clean cut from a sharp knife. I could have located the pain. I could have pointed to a photograph or a date on a calendar and said, there, that is the moment you broke us. There is the other woman. There is the evidence of my failure or your villainy. It would have been a story with a clear villain and a clear victim, a narrative that friends could gather around, offering tea and sympathy and righteous anger. But what happened in that grocery store aisle was something else entirely. It was not a wound, it was a dissolution. It was not a cut but a fading away. The lie was not in the arms of another woman, it was in the casual dexterity of his own fingers as they picked at a sticky price tag under the sterile fluorescent light. The betrayal was not in a whispered secret but in the utter silence of the act, a decision so insignificant to him he made it while probably thinking of what to have for lunch. I saw him from behind a display of canned peaches, a tower of bright yellow labels. And there he was, my husband of 4 decades, in his good wool coat, standing before a rack of glossy impersonal cakes. He did not look tormented. He did not look like a man contemplating a sin. He looked like a man comparing prices. He tilted his head the way he did when studying the thermostat. A practical man solving a practical problem. The problem presumably was that he wanted a lemon pound cake, and for reasons I will never fathom he did not want to ask me to make one. He selected one, a perfectly round cake under a dome of plastic. He looked at the price. He placed it in his cart. And then he stopped. He stood so still. I remember the way his shoulders dropped just a fraction, a sign of a man thinking a new thought. He reached into the cart, retrieved the cake, and with a careful, deliberate motion he peeled the price sticker from the plastic dome. He did it slowly, ensuring it came off clean. Then he did not put it back in the cart. He placed it in the small handheld basket hooked over his arm. He separated the cake from the rest of his groceries. He created a transaction within a transaction. In that moment the fluorescent light seemed to buzz louder. The air grew cold. I felt a distance open up between us, a vast and silent plain that all the years, all the shared meals and shared beds could never bridge. He was not just buying a cake. He was constructing an alibi. A small one, a silly one, but an alibi nonetheless. He was preparing to present this store-bought commonplace thing as something else, a special find, a thoughtful purchase. He was crafting a tiny story to tell me, a story where he was a man who went out of his way, who saw a nice cake and thought of home. He was inventing a consideration he did not feel. He was fabricating a tender moment to replace a simple lazy choice. And the object of this fabrication, this miniature theater of deceit, was the very symbol of my life's work. The lie was not in the affair, it was in the aisle, because it was a lie for no one's benefit but his own. It gained him nothing, saved him no real money, spared him no real confrontation. If he had simply brought the cake home and said, I saw this and got it, I was craving lemon cake, I would have shrugged, maybe felt a faint pinprick, but I would have understood. A whim, a change, even laziness. I could have accommodated laziness. But the lie, the deliberate, careful act of constructing a fiction that was not laziness. It was a kind of practice. It was the muscle memory of deceit exercised on something so small it was like watching a man lie about the weather. It revealed a mind that defaulted to fabrication, that found it easier to create a small untruth than to engage in a simple honest moment. It meant his relationship with the truth was casual, negotiable. And if he would lie about a cake, what would he not lie about? The answer settled in my bones cold and heavy. He would lie about anything. Not because he was a villain, but because it was easier. Because the truth required a presence, a connection, an acknowledgement of my reality that he could not be bothered to give. The aisle was the altar of his indifference. The price tag was the sacrament. His quiet, focused action was the prayer. He was not worshipping another woman. He was worshipping the god of convenience, the deity of avoiding the mildest possible discomfort of a single question. He chose the path of least resistance, even if that path wound through a childish deceit. And in choosing that, he showed me the value of my 40 years of labor. It was worth less to him than the minor awkwardness of admitting a simple desire. My cake, my tradition, my edible love was an obstacle to be circumvented with a $5 purchase and a flick of his thumb. The betrayal was in the scale. The monumental effort of my life balanced against the featherweight of his slight inconvenience, and my effort was found wanting. It was not worth the breath it would take to say, "Honey, I want cake, but don't you bother." I stood there holding my own basket containing the very lemons he was making obsolete. I felt myself becoming transparent. The canned peaches, the fluorescent lights, the linoleum floor, all seemed more solid, more real than I was in that moment. I was a ghost watching my husband from the other side of a life. The sound of the store faded into a dull roar. I saw not a man I loved, but a stranger performing a strange and petty ritual. The intimacy of 4 decades evaporated in the time it took for a sticker to come cleanly off plastic. The past did not flash before my eyes. The future did. I saw an endless line of Tuesdays, an infinite series of small avoidances, tiny lies, minor fabrications, all building a life that was entirely made of papier-mâché. A life that looked solid from the outside but was hollow, fragile, a set with no substance. The lie in the aisle was the truth unveiled. It was the pure, undistilled essence of our marriage finally visible. It was not about cake. It was about the space between us. It was about the stories he told himself and the stories he would tell me to keep that space comfortable for him. It was about his absolute belief that my reality was something he could edit with a simple sleight of hand. That my perception could be managed. That my love could be placated with a cheap substitute and a cheaper fiction. He did not see me as a partner, a person with a heart that could break over small things. He saw me as a function, a baker, a provider of cakes whose expectations could be neatly met with a grocery store purchase and a sweet little tale. The horror was in its banality. There was no grand passion driving him to it, no midlife crisis, no deep dissatisfaction. Just a man who wanted cake and did not want to talk about it. That is what broke me. Not the presence of a grand malice, but the utter absence of a grand care. The void where respect should have been. The lie was so small, so pathetic, it refused to even be dramatic. It refused to give me the dignity of a classical betrayal. It left me with nothing to fight against, nothing to name but a vast echoing indifference. I could not cry over a price sticker. I could not mourn a peeled-off bit of adhesive. I could only stand there in the buzzing light and feel the entire foundation of my life turn to sand and run out through the hourglass of that ordinary Tuesday. The affair would have been a blow. This was an erasure. He did not replace me with another woman. He replaced me with a convenience and a fiction. And in doing so he showed me I had already been gone for a very, very long time. He was just finally acting accordingly. The clarity came not as a lightning bolt but as a settling. A final grain of sand dropping onto a pile so high it could no longer sustain its own weight. It simply collapsed inward without a sound. There was no rage. Rage is a fire, and fire requires fuel, something to consume, something left to burn. What I felt was the absence of fuel. The well was dry. The kindling of hope, the logs of expectation, the oxygen of my own need for his understanding, it was all gone. There was nothing left to ignite. So there was no fire. There was only ice. A clean, sharp, pervasive cold that filled my veins and stilled my heart and brought with it a vision of shocking precision. I saw the entire architecture of our life together as if from a great height. I saw the tiny rooms I had built for myself, the kitchen, the garden, the quiet chair by the window. I saw the wide halls he roamed freely. I saw the connection between them, the little doorways of my labor, the cake, the meals, the laundry, the listening. And I saw with absolute certainty that I could simply close those doors. Not slam them, simply close them, turn the lock on my own side and walk away down the corridors of my own inner house, corridors I had not visited in decades. I did not stop baking his cake out of anger. Anger would have been an engagement, a reaction. It would have meant he still held the power to pull a string in me, to create a heat, a noise, a response. Anger would have been about him. This was not about him. This was about the reclamation of a resource. My hands, my time, my attention, my care, these were my resources. For 40 years I had funneled them ceaselessly into a single account, his account. I did it willingly, believing it was a joint fund, a shared investment. The clarity in the grocery store aisle showed me it was not. The account was in his name only. He made withdrawals of comfort and convenience, and I made deposits of my life. And now the bank was empty. The clarity was the final bank statement. So I ceased production. It was an economic decision, a quiet personal austerity. I was taking my capital out of a failing enterprise. I drove home. The steering wheel was cool under my hands. The world outside the car moved with its usual rhythm. Children at a bus stop. A man walking a dog. The sun breaking through clouds. The universe was not in mourning. It was just Tuesday, and I was just a woman in a car who had finally finished a very long task. There was a lightness to it. A terrifying unburdening. The weight I dropped was the weight of a question I had carried for 40 years, the question of, am I enough? The clarity answered it. I was more than enough. The lack was not in me. The lack was in his ability to see what was before him. I was no longer interested in trying to make myself visible to a blind man. I would simply stop standing in his line of sight. When I got home I put my purse on its hook. I took off my coat. I walked into the kitchen, the heart of my former kingdom. The yellow bowl, the worn measuring cups, the lemon zester hanging on its hook. They looked like artifacts in a museum. Relics of a civilization that had just now ceased to exist. I felt no urge to touch them, to destroy them, to weep over them. They were neutral objects again. Stripped of their meaning, their duty, their covenant. They were just things. And I was just a woman in a quiet house. He came home later. I heard his key in the lock, the sigh he always made setting his briefcase down, the shuffle of his feet on the rug. Normal sounds. The soundtrack of my life. He came into the kitchen holding the bakery bag. There was a strange careful look on his face, a performative cheer. "You'll never guess what I found today," he said. His voice was too bright, like a child presenting a poorly drawn picture. "A little bakery by the office makes lemon pound cake. Reminded me of yours. Thought we could try it." I looked at him. I looked at the bag. I looked at his face, the face I had loved, had studied for a lifetime. I saw the faint anxiety around his eyes, the hope that his little story would land. I saw not a monster but a silly man, a hollow man building a tiny stage for a tiny play. And I felt nothing. No sting, no sadness, no triumph. Just the clean, cold clarity. "How nice," I said. My voice was my own, calm and even. A peace had settled over me, a great white quiet. I took the cake from its bag. I got a knife. I sliced 2 pieces. I put them on plates. I handed him his. "Thank you," I said. He smiled, relieved. The performance was a success. The audience had applauded politely. We ate at the kitchen table. He made a show of tasting it. "It's good," he said. "Not as good as yours, of course. But good." I took a bite. It was fine. Sweet. A little dry. A generic sort of sweetness. It tasted of nothing. It tasted like the end. I chewed and swallowed. "It is good," I said. That was it. There was no thunderclap. The world did not crack. I simply decided in that moment, with the bland cake on my tongue, that I was retired. Retired from the business of baking for him. Retired from the business of translating my love into ingredients he would not understand. My hands were now my own. My mornings were now my own. The quiet in the kitchen would no longer be filled with the noise of my effort. For him, it would just be quiet. My quiet. The clarity was the understanding that my power resided not in protest but in cessation. Not in telling him he was wrong but in demonstrating that I was free. He had given me the key with his ridiculous lie. He had shown me the door was not locked from the outside. It was only ever locked from the inside by my own belief that I needed to stay in that room. I had turned the lock myself. Now I simply turned it the other way and stepped out. I did not stop baking his cake. I stopped baking my cake. The cake of obligation, the cake of longing, the cake that was my silent scream for recognition. That cake was finished. The recipe was void. The kitchen was closed. The clarity was the quiet after the last customer has left and the chairs are up on the tables and the lights are dim. It is over. There is nothing more to be done. Just the sweeping up of your own soul and the walking out into the cool night air knowing you have done all the work you will ever do for that particular hunger. His hunger was his own to manage now. My hands were finally still. The void I left behind was not an empty space. It was a presence, a living breathing silence that had a weight and a texture all its own. For 40 years my sound had been the background music of that house, the reliable hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the oven timer, the soft whisk against a bowl. It was the sound of things being done, of order being maintained, of life moving predictably forward. They never heard it until it stopped. And when it stopped, the silence that replaced it was not peaceful. It was interrogative. It asked questions they had never thought to ask. It echoed with the ghost of all my labor. The first gathering was his mother's birthday. A Sunday afternoon. The table was set, the family was there, the chatter filled the dining room. His mother Edna sat at the head of the table, her eyes sharp and expectant. She always looked for the cake first. It was her benchmark for whether the event was proper. I brought out the plates, the forks, the coffee. I brought out a store-bought apple pie. I had not even bothered with lemon. I chose something entirely different, a declaration of independence in pastry form. "Where's the cake, May?" Edna asked, her voice cutting through the talk. "I didn't make one this year," I said. My voice was calm, a flat stone dropped into a pond. I just didn't. The silence that followed was not immediate. It was a slow seep. First confusion, then a dawning sense of a shifted world. "You didn't make one," his sister Linda echoed. "But it's Mother's birthday. It's tradition." "I know," I said. I smiled, a small polite smile that gave nothing away. "I thought we'd try something different." Robert, my husband, shifted in his chair. He looked from his mother to me, his face a mask of bewildered discomfort. "It's just a pie," he said, trying to force a jovial tone. "Apple is good too." But it wasn't about the pie. It was about the absence of the cake. The cake was the cornerstone of the ritual. Without it, the entire architecture of the family gathering felt unstable, provisional. They ate the pie. They complimented it. But the compliments were hollow, puzzled. The event was off-key. The familiar song was missing its chorus. And in that space they began for the first time to sense the shape of what had always been there, holding the song together. My labor. My predictable, reliable effort. They had mistaken my effort for air, something that was just supposed to be there. Now they were gasping, subtly confused by the thinness of the atmosphere. At home the void was quieter but deeper. He would come into the kitchen in the morning expecting perhaps the smell of something baking on a weekend. There was just coffee, just silence. He would look at the counter where the cooling rack usually sat. It was empty. He didn't ask. Not at first. He was a man who navigated by habit, and his habits had all been built around the quiet constant of my service. Now he was bumping into the furniture of his own life. He asked once a few weeks later. "Feeling okay?" He said it over the newspaper at breakfast. "I'm fine," I said. "Just fine." And I was. I was reading a book about sedimentary rock. I was perfectly fine. He nodded, but the question hung there. He was asking because the absence of cake was a symptom, and he was trying to diagnose the disease without acknowledging the patient. The void was my absence from the role. And he noticed not me but the empty space where the role player used to stand. It was like an actor leaving the stage and the other actors suddenly realizing they never knew their lines, only their cues. And my cues had all been silent. A placed plate. A poured cup. A cake on a stand. Now there was no cue. They were stumbling. My daughter-in-law Anna, a sweet, perceptive young woman, pulled me aside after another quiet meal. "Is everything all right between you and Dad?" she asked, her eyes full of a concern that touched me. It was the first time anyone had asked about me, not about the cake. "We're fine, Anna," I said. "I'm just exploring some quiet." She nodded, not understanding but accepting. She felt the void too, but she called it a mood. She thought it would pass. But a void is not a mood. A mood is a weather system. It comes and goes. A void is a geological change. The landscape is different now. The power of the void was that it could not be argued with. It could not be confronted. What would he say? Why aren't you baking? It would sound ridiculous even to him. Petty. So the void just sat there in the house between us at the table during family dinners. It was my unspoken testimony. Every time someone mentioned a memory, oh remember the cake May made for so-and-so's shower, the memory would hang in the new silence, a relic from a lost world. The absence became a louder statement than the presence ever was. My quiet compliance had been a sound they understood. My quiet withdrawal was a language they could not decipher. It frightened them, not because it was angry but because it was peaceful. My peace was an accusation. My calm was a mirror showing them their own disorder, their own dependency on my unpaid invisible labor. He tried to fill the void once. He brought home a bakery cake again, a different one with strawberries on it. A peace offering or a replacement. I thanked him. I put it on a plate. We ate it. It was sweet and sad. He was trying to supply the thing himself to perform the function. But he didn't understand. The cake was never the point. The point was the making. The point was the intention. The point was the love. He was offering a substitute for a substitute. A copy of a copy. And the void yawned wider because his attempt only highlighted what was missing. He was treating the symptom. The disease was his lifelong indifference and my newfound immunity to it. The void was finally louder than I ever was because it forced them to listen. To the silence. To their own thoughts. To the awkward gaps in conversation where my baking or my serving or my cleaning would have given them something to do, something to talk about. It forced him to see the machinery of his own comfort and to realize for the first time that it had always been powered by my silent will. Now the power was off. The machine was still, and he was alone in the quiet house with the ghost of all he had taken for granted. The ghost did not wail. It did not reproach. It simply was. A presence in the shape of an absence. And that was a sound he had no defense against. My words he could have argued with. My tears he could have dismissed. My anger he could have weathered. But my serene silent void, it was a force of nature. It was the tide going out and leaving all the wreckage of our marriage exposed on the bare sand. He had to stand there and look at it. And in that looking he finally began perhaps to see. Not me, not yet. But the empty space where I had been. And that was the beginning of everything. His regret when it finally surfaced was not a flood. It was a slow leak. A dampness seeping through the walls of his certainty. It did not come with grand apologies or weeping pleas. It came as a series of small bewildered actions, a man poking at a silent television set wondering why there was no picture. His first question was not about us. It was not about the heart of the matter. It was about my behavior, a malfunction in the system he had relied upon. What's wrong with you? The you was the key. The problem was located in me. I was the deviation from the norm, the broken appliance. He stood in the kitchen one evening a month into the great quiet. I was reading at the table a book on geology, open to a page about slate, how pressure and time could transform soft clay into something that could be split into clean sharp sheets. He had been hovering. A new habit. He would enter a room I was in and simply stand as if waiting for the room to revert to its old configuration. When it didn't, he finally spoke. What's wrong with you? You're so quiet. You don't bake anymore. You're just different. I looked up from my book. I met his eyes. There was no anger in my gaze. No challenge. Just the same clear quiet that now lived inside me. I'm fine, Robert the First said. Just reading. He blinked. My calm was a wall his confusion could not scale. But what did I do? He asked next. This was progress of a sort. The problem was now an action. A single transgression he could identify and fix. If he could just find the broken step, he could repair it and the staircase would lead back to the familiar landing. What did I do? The question was so small, so entirely missing the point that it almost made me smile. A sad soft smile. You bought a cake, Robert the First said. And you lied about it. I said it the way I might remark on the weather. A simple fact. He stared at me. His face went through a series of adjustments. Bafflement. Irritation. A dawning ridiculousness. A cake. That's what this is about. A goddamn cake. His voice rose, but not in anger. In utter exasperation. He threw his hands up. I was trying to be nice. I saw it and I thought of you. This was his truth now. The fiction had become his memory. He had convinced himself of his own little story. He was the thoughtful husband bringing home a treat. My refusal to play my part was a perversity. I didn't argue. I simply went back to my book. The pressure and the time. The forming of the slate. My silence after my statement was more powerful than any argument. It said the conversation was over. The truth had been stated. It needed no defense, no elaboration. It just was. That was the first layer of his regret. It was the regret of inconvenience. His life was no longer smooth. The gears were grinding. He missed the cake. He missed the sweet predictable ending to his meals. He missed the praise from his family. He missed the way my baking had made him feel like a man with a certain kind of wife, a traditional wife, a good wife. Her absence from that role made him look differently to himself and to others. "What's wrong with May?" his mother had asked him on the phone, her voice sharp with implication that if I was failing it was his failure to manage. His regret was for the social discomfort, for the nagging sense that his domestic ecosystem was failing. He tried other tactics. Sulking. A passive aggression of his own. Leaving dishes in the sink. Slightly more than usual. Coming home later. Playing the television louder. These were the tools of a man who only knew how to negotiate for services rendered. He was trying to provoke a response, any response, to prove I was still in the game, that I still cared enough to be annoyed. But I was not annoyed. I was gone. I would wash the dish if it was in my way. I would be asleep when he came home. I would go into another room. His noises could not fill my quiet. His regret deepened from inconvenience to frustration. Nothing worked. The lever he had pulled for 40 years to get the result he wanted was disconnected. Then came the attempts at replacement. He brought flowers, carnations from the grocery store wrapped in green plastic. They were the kind you buy out of guilt. I put them in water. I thanked him. They died on the windowsill. He offered to take me out to dinner. "Anywhere you want," he said. I chose a simple place. We ate. We made conversation about the food, about the weather. It was like dining with a pleasant acquaintance. I could feel him straining for the old rhythm, the old script. He would mention a memory, expecting the warm glow of shared nostalgia to rekindle something. I would nod. Yes, I remember. And then I would return to my salmon. The warmth did not come. I was not withholding it. It simply was not there to give. The furnace was out. He was shivering in a cold house and could not understand why I was not cold too. His regret then turned to a form of panic. A quiet, desperate panic. This was when he began to truly see the void, not just as an absence of cake but as an absence of me. The real me. The woman behind the tasks. He had never known her, so he did not know what he was missing. But he could feel the shape of the emptiness. One night he came and stood in the doorway of the living room. I was sitting in the lamplight, not reading, just sitting, watching the shadows on the wall. He said my name, May, just that. It was a question, a plea. I turned my head. "Yes, Robert. Who are you?" he asked. And it was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. It was not "What's wrong with you?" It was "Who are you?" He was finally seeing that the person he lived with was a stranger. "I am right here," I said. "But you're not," he whispered. "You're gone." "I am here," I repeated calmly. "I am just not where you left me." That was the moment his regret cracked open. It was no longer about his comfort. It was about his loss. A loss he could not define, could not quantify. He had lost the idea of me. The reliable concept. And in its place was this calm, impenetrable woman of slate. He had taken the soft clay for granted, had assumed it would always hold the shape he gave it. He never imagined the pressure, he never imagined the time. Now he was faced with the result. Something that could not be molded, only split. His regret after that was a hollow thing. A quiet morning, he would look at me across the table and I could see him trying to find a way back. A door in, but the doors were closed. Not locked. Just closed. He had never had a key because he had never asked for one. He had been content with the service entrance. Now that was shut and the main entrance was unfamiliar to him. He never said "I'm sorry for not seeing you." He never said "I'm sorry for taking your love and making it a chore." His regret was not for the loneliness he had woven into the fabric of my days. It was for the consequence. He was sorry I had stopped. He was sorry he felt cold. He was sorry the house echoed. His regret was for his own discomfort in the empty space I had left behind. It was a selfish regret. A final proof of the very thing that had ended us. He noticed I was gone the way a man notices a favorite chair has been removed. He misses the comfort of it. He does not mourn the chair. He mourns his own aching back. His regret was for the absence of the cake, not for the absence of the baker. And in that final understanding I found my complete and total freedom. For I no longer needed his regret to be anything other than what it was. It was his, and I was mine. My awakening did not come in a flash of light or a chorus of voices. It came in the empty spaces, in the quiet hours that were no longer pre-filled with the recipe of his expectation. The unbaking was not an act of destruction. It was an act of excavation. With each habit I laid down, each automatic gesture I refused, I was clearing away the rubble of a life lived for a ghost, a phantom of a man who only existed in my need for him to be different. I was digging down to the bedrock of myself, a layer I had not felt beneath my feet in 40 years. And what I found there was not a new woman. She was terribly old. She was the girl I had been before I learned to preheat an oven for someone else's pleasure. She was quiet, yes, but her quiet was not the quiet of suppression. It was the quiet of a deep well of clear cold water. Untouched. Waiting. The first morning I did not get up with the sun to begin the breakfast, the tidying, the mental list of his needs. I simply lay in bed. I listened to the birds. I watched the pattern of light from the window shift on the ceiling. I felt the weight of my own body on the mattress. It was my body, not an instrument for labor, not an object for appraisal. Just mine. The bones, the skin, the breath. It was a radical act of possession. I got up when I was ready. I made coffee, not for the pot, not for the ritual of his cup, but for the smell I loved, for the warmth in my own hands. I took it to the porch and I sat. I did nothing. I was not waiting for the day to begin. It had already begun inside me. I enrolled in a class. Geology. The study of pressure and time. Of how the world is built and broken and rebuilt. I did not tell him. It was not a secret. It was simply none of his business. My learning was my own. Sitting in that classroom with younger people with their bright eyes and their frantic notes, I felt no embarrassment at my age. I felt a kind of reverence. My life, my years were my own layer of sediment. I was there to understand the process. When the professor spoke of metamorphic rock, of how heat and pressure create something entirely new, something stronger, I felt a shift inside my own strata. I was not being heated by anger. I was being transformed by the immense patient pressure of a truth finally acknowledged. I was becoming Slate. I took drives. I would get in the car with no destination. I would turn down roads I had never seen. I passed fields and broken barns and streams choked with leaves. I rolled the window down and let the air rush in. It was not running away. It was exploration. The territory was my own life, the landscape of possibilities I had closed off one by one in service to a smaller world. I was reopening the map. I stopped at a diner alone and ate pie at 2 in the afternoon. I smiled at the waitress. We did not speak. It was a communion of strangers. It was beautiful. I went to the library, the hushed sanctuary of other people's minds. I wandered the stacks. I ran my fingers over the spines of books I would never read. It was enough to know they were there, that the world was so vast and so full of thinking. I checked out a book on constellations. At night I would sit in the backyard in the old lawn chair, the one with the fraying strap. I would look up. I learned to find Cygnus the swan, Lyra the harp. Their light had been traveling for millennia to fall on my eyes in that moment. My problems, my marriage, my quiet aching history were less than a breath in that scale. The peace that gave me was not a diminishment. It was an expansion. I was a small woman on a small chair on a spinning planet, and I was part of the cosmos. My silence was now a listening. I was listening to the universe hum. The unbaking was the meticulous subtraction of his taste from my world. I stopped buying the coffee he preferred. I stopped seasoning food to his palate. I cooked for nourishment and sometimes for curiosity. A strange vegetable from the market. A spice I could not name. My kitchen became a laboratory for my own senses. Sometimes I made a mess. Sometimes it tasted wrong. It did not matter. There was no one to judge it. The critic was gone because I had stopped performing for the audience of one. I found my hands could do other things. They could sketch the shape of a leaf in a notebook. They could plant a seed and wait for it to break ground. They could hold a library book and turn its pages with a slow considered reverence. They were no longer tools. They were instruments of discovery. My mind too began to change. It was not occupied with the endless circular worry of is he happy, is he comfortable, is he satisfied. It was free to follow a thought down a long corridor to see where it led. I thought about my mother. I thought about rivers. I thought about the sound of rain on a tin roof. My thoughts were my own companions. They did not need to be translated into action, into service, into cake. The peace I found was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of myself. A full, complete presence that required no external validation. His confusion, his regret, his hollow attempts to fill the void, they happened in a parallel world. A world I had emigrated from. I could see them. I could hear them. But they could not touch the core of me. The core was solid now. Fortified by silence and self-possession. I began to dream again. Vivid, nonsensical dreams of flying over landscapes I had never seen. Of swimming in dark, warm water. Of conversations with people long gone who smiled at me with knowing eyes. I would wake from these dreams not with fatigue but with a sense of having traveled. My inner life was no longer a barren room where I rehashed the day's disappointments. It was a fertile, wild country. I was its only citizen and its happy explorer. The final stage of the unbaking was the release of the story. The story of the wronged wife. The martyr of the kitchen. That story had given me a kind of identity for a while. But even that identity was a cage. One day I realized I no longer thought of myself in relation to him at all. I was not the woman who left. I was the woman who was here. My past was not a chain. It was simply the ground I had walked across to get to this point. I forgave him not for his sake but for mine. I forgave him his smallness, his blindness, his pathetic grocery store lie. I forgave him so I would not have to carry the weight of his failure anymore. I set it down on the side of the road and kept walking. My awakening was in the unbaking because for 40 years I had believed I was the cake. Something to be perfected, presented, consumed and appreciated. I had built my soul around a recipe for acceptance. Now I understood I was not the confection. I was the baker, and the baker was free to close the shop, to take off her apron, to walk out into the morning and decide if she wanted to make something else or make nothing at all. The power was in the choice. The freedom was in the empty bowl, the clean hands, the silent oven. I sit now in my quiet. It is a different quiet. It is not the quiet of waiting. It is the quiet of arrival. The sun moves across the floor. The clock ticks. I breathe. In the space where the baking used to be there is now a profound and unshakable peace. It is not happiness which is a fleeting weather. It is contentment which is the climate of a soul that is finally at home within itself. The unbaking was not an ending. It was the most authentic beginning of my life. I had spent decades building a monument to us. Now I was sitting in the gentle, endless, beautiful ruin of just me. And it was more than enough. It was everything. There is a life that begins after the doing stops. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't require a new city or a new name. It begins in the chair you sit in when you are no longer waiting for the phone to ring. It begins in the cup of tea you make just for the scent of it, just for the warmth in your own palms. It begins when you realize the silence around you is not an emptiness but a presence, your own presence, finally filling the space you had always loaned out to others. For 40 years I believed my love was an active thing. A constant doing, a constant proving, a constant offering. I believed it had to be visible to be real. Measured in perfect layers and golden crusts. I was wrong. The truest love I have ever found has been in the cessation. In the gentle, final act of setting down the burden of proving I was worthy of being seen. The love I have for myself now is not baked. It is not decorated. It is not served on a platter for anyone's consumption or critique. It is a quiet, resilient thing. A seed that finally broke through a hard-packed earth it had been under for a lifetime. It grows in the dark, in the quiet, without any applause. And its growth is the only proof I need. To anyone listening who is still in the kitchen of someone else's life, measuring your worth by their appetite, I am not telling you to leave. I am only asking you to consider what might happen if you just turned off the oven, sat down, and listened to the silence you have been filling with noise for them. You might hear your own voice there. It might be faint at first. A whisper under the hum of the refrigerator. It might simply say, I am tired. Or, this is not enough. Or maybe it says nothing at all. Maybe it just breathes. And that breath, your own unhurried, unburdened breath, is the beginning of a new recipe. One written in a language only you understand, for a nourishment only you can give yourself. My story is not about a cake. It is about the ingredient I forgot to include in every single thing I ever made, my own peace. Once I tasted it, I lost my taste for everything else. The oven is cool now. The kitchen is still. And I am finally, completely, home. Good night, my dears. And may you find the courage to cherish your own quiet. It is the most powerful sound you will ever make.